I'm John Paul, and it's really a pleasure to be with all of you by way of this means today. I'm caught between a beautiful tree and a barbed wire fence, which is where I think most of us are caught these days. It's terrific to hear what Impact is doing. It's extraordinary to know the gathering of people, and in particular a kind of a network of networks that's linking in to local communities and to local experiences, but tied into the global challenges that we have. And I think those challenges really are probably best known by all of us with the proximity that we have to the expressions they take where we live. The deep and very toxic polarization that's emergent over so many issues, the tendencies toward authoritarianism that offer solutions by way of narrowing our capacity for holding diversity and disagreement to specific forms of control. The sharp rise of violence in so many places. In particular, I think my experience has been the last few months that the Israeli-Gazan unfolding of the conflict has been one that, perhaps more than any other in my life of working, has created 0 degrees of separation, that we all are impacted in one form or another by the deep divisions and the absolute dehumanization that has been coming from the beginning of, in particular, the early October events through to today, that seem to have a ceaseless cycle of challenges. So I think we know what these are. We know how they express themselves quite often locally, and our real challenge is not so much moving quickly to solutions, because too often that brings our attention exclusively to the content, but to the fact that these are deep patterns of systemic relationships, and they are deeply connected and equally as much on the side of actual face-to-face relationships. So how to combine the relationships that we have where we live in ways that make a difference in people's lives, while we understand that those are part of a wider web of connections to the patterns that systemically unfold in so many of these situations. This is really where much of our work sits. We know that it is the quality of relationships that makes a difference more than the quantity of weapons or the content of policy. While policy and working on specific forms of concrete change are important, ultimately we come back, I think, to the fact that social change is relationship centric, which is why gatherings of the kind that you're engaged in and holding the spaces for highly improbable and unlikely alliances to emerge across geographies and across levels of society and across divergent points of view about where we place our energy. Holding these spaces that bring together and stitch together our islands of positive deviance, if you will, our islands of making a difference, are really significant in the big picture of what is most needed in our world today. How do we center ourselves and continue to work at our well-being, both within ourselves and between those relationships that are significant where we're working, and at the same time know that we are facing very extensive levels of dissonance and noise and challenges that can easily burn us out. And I think those are probably where my lessons would start. So if I had 2 or 3 to share, one, I think, has been understanding that this work is for the long haul, and you need to prepare yourself to be able to take the long journey. At the same time, you're facing most likely 100 crises. So how to become more crisis responsive rather than crisis driven? with a horizon of change in mind that you're seeking to build, with that long-term strategy always linked up to how you're choosing to respond to the particular challenges that any crisis offers us, I think is so key. Because being crisis responsive and long-term strategic means we have to have clarity of self and clarity of relationships and openness to work with and alongside people who may see the world very differently than us and who may be engaged in things that are not our areas of understanding or specialty, but that ultimately we will need if we are to make change last. So I think the first one is a time frame notion and a notion of personal and relational well-being. How to hold to those things that bring aliveness in our life rather than finding ourselves caught so much in the crisis that we burn out. For 4.5 decades of work, I think the biggest challenge that I've found is helping people stay the course in ways that are both joy-filled and are also clear with how their well-being can be attended to. A second big lesson for me simply has to do with this element that I mentioned earlier about working across improbable relationships and what we call in Colombia those improbable dialogues. The idea that our task is not to convince the world to think just like us and to join our particular group. It is how our groups, our work, our piece of this big puzzle can find connection with other pieces that help create a wider whole. And we are, I believe, constantly challenged by the pulls of polarization that want to push us back to our own bubbles where exclusively we meet with people who think only like us. So a word of encouragement for the networking. Remain clear about your deepest convictions in the areas of work that you have access to and where you can make a difference. Remain equally committed to openness, to this form of suppleness that permits you to look more widely at what others are doing and how they're doing it, even if they appear throughout to be somewhat different, if not perhaps in opposition. It is when the unlikely aligns, when there is a confluence of the unexpected, that we find that the greatest potential for change happens. So stay clear to conviction and open to things that you're not fully aware of or that you may not fully understand. As a group in Colombia once put it that I was very close to, we will seek to understand those who do not understand us. What a goal in life, to place listening and understanding at the core of what you do, with the big picture of how you contribute to it, but how other streams of contribution may be happening that are different than yours. And the final little note or lesson is a lesson about how risk and hope are connected. It was by way of my work with the moral imagination, particular book, that I began to explore more seriously the imagination of risk. And what I found pretty consistently with communities and places that face some of the hardest and most difficult situations is that they had learned a lot from those situations about the risks that they could or were willing to take. And those rarely were risks of large leaps. They were what was clear today, the step that I can take. One risk at a time that's within reach. This whole notion that we step into what it is that we know that today we must move toward. That notion of one step at a time accumulates over time into a whole journey that sometimes has the capacity to make much larger shifts and connections. That's how I actually believe hope is often a bit put down for the fact that people say, well, hope is not a strategy. I heard somebody this past weekend say something very similar to that. My understanding it may sit just slightly divergent from that, and that is that I have never actually seen change happen without hope. People that keep it alive, who by the form that they embody their conviction, by the forms that they embody their relationships and moving together, who embody this idea of taking the step of what is clear to you today, those steps actually constitute hope. They constitute action. Hope is not a distant thing that we imagine but is unattainable, hope is actually found in the ways that we take the steps. The poet Jorge Luis Borges in Argentina, when asked about hope, used to say it first in Spanish because it always helps me remember it correctly. When asked about esperanza, hope, he said, la esperanza, ese hermoso recuerdo del futuro. Hope, hope, he said, this beautiful memory of the future. So remember that you can remember the future as well as the past, that it is possible to unfold a journey, but it takes imagination about the risk and the step that we can take today. And that would be the encouragement that I give you. Come with a kind of tender tenacity, tenderness in the softness and suppleness and openness to that which is not fully understood that others may carry, but tenacity in the form of holding fast to the convictions that you feel most deeply about, and finding ways to continually move and work on and develop approaches that make those things that are the matter of that conviction possible. But here I am, as many of you, between the strength of a tree trunk and nature and the barbed wires that want to separate our lives and cause damage to much of us, to much of what we're trying to build. So I'll leave it as a bit of a metaphor and wish you all the best. Thank you, and may you have truly a wonderful encounter, and much thanks to the team at Impact and everything that they've been doing.